Open your next lesson in the Civil War titled Turmoil on the Home Front. Our objective is to recognize the political, economic, and social and educational turmoil that the North and South experienced during the Civil War. Look at your vocabulary words. Certificates given by a government to its people when it borrows money from them are bonds. To require military service of individuals, the draft, is conscription. To inflame the passion in people against something is incite. Any food that is the main diet of people, such as bread and milk, is staple. Imagine for a moment, if you can, having to say goodbye to a dad or brother who is about to go off to war. You know that once he leaves the house, you will not hear from him again for a long time. There is a lot of fear and anxiety as the family says goodbye, for you have read the newspapers, and you know how the conflict is taking its toll on people's lives. You have no idea if this is the last time you get to see his face, or whether he will return missing a limb. It's truly a painful thought. A nation suffering through war goes through a broad range of emotions. Some people are for war, others are against it. Either way, a war greatly affects those who stay at home. The parent remaining home suddenly has the sole responsibility for maintaining the household. Boys sometimes have to become the father to their younger siblings. Many children are forced to go to work at a much younger age than they should have to in order to make ends meet. In the lesson today, you'll study a little about the turmoil brought on when thousands of people leave their homes to fight in a war. The families they leave behind have to completely change the way they live in order to survive. They struggle as news about the conflict reaches them. It is a very difficult time indeed. War affects a nation in different ways. There are political groups for and against the conflict. The economic focus turns to making weapons and providing for troops rather than things for the home or families. The entire social climate changes from one of hope to one of subdued uncertainty. Children are even affected educationally as they are forced to deal with absent parents and teachers. How did the Civil War affect people living in the North and South? Okay, go ahead and put your date in your notes. Okay, we want to know how the war affected people. Let's talk about politically. Political. I'm going to make a T-chart. The North and the South. Okay, I already put that there. Alright. Politically, the North was in a great deal of turmoil during the war. Republicans, for the most part, supported Lincoln's decisions. The Democrats were split into two factions. The War Democrats supported the war effort, while the Democrat Copperheads were very much opposed to it. They had believed all along that compromise was the best tool to solve the secession issue and blasted Lincoln for going to war. The Copperheads especially despised the war and did everything they could to bring it to an end. They were known to incite riots, to try to get Union soldiers to leave their posts, and some were even accused of helping the Confederacy. They owned a number of newspapers that treated President Lincoln very harshly at times. Their political turmoil kept emotions at a boiling point for much of the war. The problems only got worse when Lincoln enacted the Enrollment Act of Conscription in 1863. This was the nation's first draft, and naturally it did not sit well with the Copperheads. As opposition mounted, Lincoln actually had several of their leaders arrested and imprisoned. Okay, so politically, we have the Republicans. And remember, Lincoln's a Republican. They fully supported Lincoln. Okay, so they supported Lincoln. Okay. Now remember, the Democrats were split. We have the War Democrats. And obviously, they supported the war. That's why they're called War Democrats. And we have the Democrat Copperheads. So we have the Copperheads. And they believed in compromise. They thought there was some compromise that could have stopped the war. And we just read about how the Copperheads incited riots. They treated President Lincoln very harshly. So they treated the president harshly. Okay, it said that Lincoln enacted the Enrollment Act of Conscription. Do you understand what that means? That means he called a draft. People were drafted to go to war. It says that Lincoln had many of their leaders arrested. Okay, so many of their leaders were arrested. Didn't make this big enough. Alright, now let's look at the box for your information. During the Civil War, there was a group of Democrats who were very vocal about their opposition to the war. They wore badges made from copper pennies, thus giving them the name Copperheads. Some advocated violence against President Lincoln, and a few actually conspired with the Confederacy. In other instances, Lincoln had them arrested and imprisoned without charges for long stretches at a time. Because remember, we read in the last lesson that Lincoln halted the habeas corpus, which said that you couldn't be arrested without cause. And so since he put a stop to the habeas corpus during the war, he was allowed, it enabled him to arrest these leaders without charging them. Okay? Let's talk about the South. In the South, meanwhile, political problems were few in comparison, yet no less damaging. There was only one political party in the South, so opposition to the war was toned down quite a bit. President Davis did have issues with some of his governors, which hurt the Confederate cause to some extent. The most difficult obstacle for the South to overcome dealt with the very issue that had brought about secession in the first place: states' rights. So their biggest obstacle is states' rights. Getting all the states to support the government's policies ran counter to the rights of those states to do what they wanted. So they still didn't want to support the government. To force them to comply with policies was against their fundamental right. So they didn't want to support any government. Okay, so this is... So politically, there's a lot of political effects in the North, but there's not many in the South. In the North, They had the Republican Party, which supported Lincoln. Remember, Lincoln's a Republican. They had the War Democrats, because remember, the Democratic Party is split, and the War Democrats, obviously, they were for war. The Copperheads, they thought that there was a compromise that could have stopped everyone from going to war, so they were really against Lincoln for declaring war. They caused riots. They treated the president harshly. So in turn, President Lincoln had a lot of their leaders arrested. It says they wore, excuse me, I'm sorry. It says they wore badges made of copper pennies, which is why they're called Copperheads. Alright? Now we're going to talk about economic. Let's talk about the economic effects. Alright? It said the South, the only political problem in the South was the South wanted states' rights. They wanted to do what they wanted. They didn't want to have to support a government, which is why they seceded in the first place. And so it was still causing problems. Now we're going to talk about economic differences. Okay, we have the North and the South. I mean, not economic differences, economic effects. Without a doubt, the South suffered economically far more than the North. From the beginning, the North held a huge edge of industry and transportation. The gap between the two sides only grew larger as the war progressed. Okay, so the North was far advanced in industry and transportation, and remember, we talked about that, how the South was so, the South had slave labor, so they didn't have a lot of industry. The only transportation they had was the rivers, remember? But the North was built on industry, and so they had all these technological advances. So the North was more advanced in industry and transportation. Okay. In addition, much of the war was fought on southern soil. Okay. Most of the war was fought here. Okay, most of the war was fought in the South. Therefore, what little industry that was encountered was destroyed. Thousands of acres of prime farmland were ravaged by Union forces as they made their way south. General William Sherman, in particular, destroyed everything in his 60-mile-wide path as he rampaged through the South in the latter stages of the war. And this lesson really didn't talk a lot about Sherman, but Sherman did a lot to help the North win the war. Since most of the war was fought here, all the industry, all the land that they had was being destroyed. Okay? The third economic factor facing the Confederacy was the Union blockade. This greatly reduced the amount of trade the South could do with foreign nations. As a result, European nations began to look for other sources of cotton and agricultural products. Okay, remember the Union blockade? Remember the Anaconda Plan? It said in order to defeat the South, you're going to have to block all their ports so they can't trade. So this blockade is hurting them economically as well. not only is what they have being destroyed, they can't get any from anywhere because their ports are blocked. Okay, in order to pay off debts and have enough money to survive, the Confederacy printed vast amounts of cash. This may sound like a good idea. It made the value of Confederate money nearly worthless as the war neared its end. Okay, so they printed their own, they had their own money, but they overprinted. So they have an overabundance of cash. And what, remember in economics, the law of supply and demand, if you have a lot of something, it's not worth very much. Okay, they have a lot of, they have an overabundance of cash, so it's not worth anything. That's kind of like if you have $100 of gold. Let's say you have $100 of gold. The country has $100 of gold, and we print, let's say we print 20 coins. That means that each of these are worth 5 cents. $5, I'm sorry, $5. Let's say we have $100 in gold, and we print two coins. That means these are each worth $50 each. So the more you print, the less it's going to be worth. Okay? Alright. Finally, as the war progressed, more and more Southern property was destroyed or lost. This resulted in many people being without jobs. In some cases, as plantations were wiped out, thousands of slaves were either set free or escaped. Okay. So, their land is being destroyed. So the slaves, it says they were either set free or escaped. Now remember, their whole livelihood, their whole economic system is centered around the slaves. The slaves do all their work for them. They don't have to pay them hardly anything. Well, now that the slaves are gone, or most of them, now they don't have any way of doing that work themselves. They don't have the funds to pay for it. Plus, their land is destroyed. So this is greatly devastating the South. The Confederacy had no financial means to meet the needs of these people. Toward the end of the war, the Confederate government did enact some tax legislature, but it was too little, too late. For your information, look at the blue box. The blockade of Confederate ports was part of the original Anaconda Plan. And it worked very well for the Union. It was estimated that the South experienced a 95% reduction in foreign business, even though most blockade runners were successful. If a Union ship seized a blockade runner, the crew got to share in the spoils. In some cases, they made a lot of money. So let's talk about the North. We talked about the South. The Northern economy, on the other hand, benefited greatly from the war. Industry, particularly coal and steel, mushroomed to new heights. Okay. So their industry actually increased. Because now they need things for the war. To go to war, you're going to need more coal, you're going to need more steel. So it's increasing their industry. Although immigration slowed down during the war, there were still plenty of people to staff the many businesses springing up all over the North. These industries were able to trade freely with foreign nations, which only helped them grow more rapidly. Okay, now they can't trade because of the blockade, but the North can still trade freely. since very little of the war was fought on northern soil, the countryside was not ravaged like the South. For many, the war was not being experienced firsthand as it was for those in the South. The North also benefited from an already established taxation and treasury system that made it much easier to finance the war. Okay, so the North has the treasury system on its side. So the North is able to finance the war. It can pay for everything that it needs. The federal government sold millions of dollars in war bonds to meet the demands of an increasingly expensive war. Okay? So economically, the North is more advanced in industry and transportation. The industry is actually increasing during the war because they have to, there's a demand for more supplies, for more war supplies, there's a demand for weapons, and also they can still trade freely and they have the money to finance the war. But the South, most of the war was fought in the South, so a lot of their land was destroyed. Much of the industries that they did have were destroyed. Remember the Union blockade? It's blocking the ports so they can't trade. So in an effort to solve the problem, they overprinted cash, which made it worth hardly anything. Their slaves, their main workers were the slaves, and they were set free or escaped. So the South is hurt worse economically. Okay? Now let's talk about socially. Socially. Okay, here's my box. The North and the South. Despite much of the war being fought in the South, the conflict had an enormous impact in northern society. Mounting war casualties left more and more families without husbands and fathers. As a result, when Lincoln issued the Enrollment Act of Conscription, many people rebelled. Okay, the Enrollment Act. Now remember, this is also called the draft. It says people rebelled. In New York City, for example, a huge riot erupted. The governor of New York, Horatio Seymour, despised Lincoln and would often publicly ridiculed the president. Okay, so the New York governor. Okay. People rebelled. There was a riot in New York City over this draft. The governor of New York, Horatio, ridiculed Lincoln. Okay, the governor, Horatio, ridiculed him. The resentment toward the act stemmed from a clause that allowed wealthier men to get out of service by paying $300 paying a $300 fee, because most people could not afford such an amount. particularly those who had recently immigrated to America. They demonstrated against the act. So the one thing that really caused problems was you could pay $300 and get out of the draft. $300 to get out of the draft. Okay. The mass of people grew violent, and it took several days to calm the city down. By then, as many as 100 people had lost their lives. The North was not the only place that had to deal with riots, however. Okay. So, 100 people died due to the riot. Let's do the blue box. It says this might help. Congress passed the first draft in March of 1863. When the first drawing of names occurred in July, many people felt it unfair since rich men could get out of being drafted by paying a $300 fee. A group set fire to the building where the draft was being held, and this ignited a citywide firestorm. Tens of thousands, many of Irish immigrants, destroyed buildings and killed innocent bystanders. The rioters targeted blacks who they felt were taking jobs away from others. The riot ended after 4 bloody days. Okay, let's talk about the South. The Confederate Society suffered the most from the war. Northern population was more than double that of the South. Therefore, more Northern troops were able to be used. As the war dragged on, many of the Southern men had trudged off, leaving few to watch the home front. Consequently, plantations suffered deeply as women suddenly found themselves in charge of many slaves. They were not prepared for this task, as men had always maintained the plantations. More and more slaves stopped working altogether or simply left, leaving nothing for the women. Okay. Okay. Many men left. The women weren't used to being in charge. So when the men left, the slaves stopped working. Or they left. So there's nothing left for the women. With the South facing financial ruin, the price for food began to skyrocket. Okay. Food prices skyrocketed. Skyrocketed. Matters were made worse by Northern armies that destroyed everything as they made their way through the South. Riots protesting the high cost of bread, milk, and other staples broke out in the South. So the South is having riots, but it's not over being drafted. Their riots are over the food prices. Okay, now the slaves usually did all their work. Since the slave left, there's not much food. Since there's not much, remember the law of supply and demand. If there's not much of something, the price is high. And so the prices of food skyrocketed. So now there are riots over the prices of food. One riot in Richmond was finally stopped after President Davis threatened to fire on protesters. Okay, so let's talk about how it's affecting the North and South socially. Lincoln passed the Enrollment Act, which is the draft. People rebelled. There was a New York City riot. The governor, Horatio, ridiculed the president. What made them really mad is that rich people could get out of the war. All you had to do is pay $300 and you don't have to go to war. 100 people died because of this riot. This riot lasted 4 days. Okay, in the South, many men left, which means, so the slaves stopped working and many of them escaped. And since there was nobody there to plant the food, there wasn't much food. So the food prices skyrocketed, and then riots broke out over the food prices. And it says, the riot in Richmond stopped when President Davis said he would fire on it if it didn't. When President Davis threatened to fire. Okay? So we've talked about social problems, the social effects of the war, the economic effects of the war, and the political effects of the war. Let's talk about the educational effects. Educational effects. Okay, we have the North and the South. Let's talk about the South. Education in Civil War America was nothing like it is today. Many children worked in factories in the North and on farms in the South. As a result, helping the family's financial situation was more important than learning to read and write. In the South, there were few schools outside the private academies offered to the wealthy. Most schools were located in rundown buildings or one-room houses. Many poor children were taught by parents who could barely read and write themselves. Consequently, the quality of education was poor. African Americans were rarely given the opportunity to attend school. So it says, working was more important than learning to read and write. So working was more important. It says there were private academies for the wealthy. Most schools were located in rundown buildings. Okay. Most were in rundown buildings. Poor children were taught by their parents. And many of their parents couldn't read or write either. So the education in the South was very poor. African Americans were rarely given the opportunity to attend school. So they rarely attended school. Okay, now the North, the education system in the North was better developed than the South. There were grades and separate schools for boys and girls. Okay, so the North, they had grades and they had separate schools for boys and girls. African Americans had their own schools, but the schools were almost always poorly financed. African Americans had their own schools, and they were poorly financed. Orphan schools were established for those children who had lost their parents in the war. Okay, so they have orphan schools. In many cases, schools in the North and South were more geared toward helping young people learn to trade than reading and writing. Okay, so they were taught how to trade. They weren't really taught reading and writing. If they went to school, they were taught to trade and how to trade. Okay, so let's review. Before completing the problem set, make sure you understand the main points of the lesson. Politics were dominated in the North by Democrat Copperheads who were opposed to the war. In the South, some state political leaders did not want the Confederacy to tell them what to do. The South suffered terribly from a war that was fought mostly on its soil with a northern blockade that prevented trade with foreign nations. The North's industrial strength grew as the war progressed. Riots broke out in the North after Lincoln issued the Enrollment of Act of Conscription in 1863. Remember, that means the draft. He called it a draft. Riots broke out in the South due to food shortages and the high cost of staple goods. Southern education was, for the most part, limited to those who could afford private schools. Public education in the North began to take on the characteristics of today's educational programs. Okay, let's look at our graph. Education. In the South, working was more important than going to school. They did have private academies for the wealthy. Most were in rundown buildings. The poor were taught by the parents, who didn't know a whole lot more than they did. African Americans rarely attended school, and if they went to school, really they weren't taught reading and writing. They were taught how to trade. In the North, they had grades. They had separate schools for boys and girls. African Americans had their own schools, but the schools were poorly financed. They started orphan schools for the students who lost their parents in the war, and they were taught to trade, okay, in schools. Go ahead and review this lesson, continue memorizing the Gettysburg Address, and answer the questions.